Just a quick sound check. We're going to head a different direction. Thirsty Peace. We're going to get back what matters the most. Just going to do a chapter. See how it works out. See if this, we're going to head a different direction. I might take a good, do a chapter. It's a few pages. Shit, it might be too long. You dig? But let's slow walk it. Not trying to tire myself out. But anyway, national bestseller, Slavery by Another Name. The re-enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. Douglas A. Blackman. Right? One is called The Slow Poison. The Slow Poison. Right? The Wedding. Fruits of Freedom. Chapter 1. Freedom wasn't yet 3 years old when the wedding day came. Henry Cottenham and Mary Bishop had been chattel slaves until the momentous final days of the Civil War. Okay? As nameless in the eyes of the law as cows in the field. All their lives, they could no more have obtained a marriage license than purchased a horse, a wagon, or a train ticket to freedom in the North. Then a final furious sweep of Union soldiers in a bewildering blur of liberation and terror unleashed from a distant war ravaged the Chpt River Valley. Henry, okay, was suddenly a man. Mary was a woman, a slave girl no more, right? They're saying thanks to the Union soldiers. Here they stood, bride and groom, before John Wesley Starr, the coarse old preacher who a blink of an eye before had spent his Sundays teaching white people that slavery was the manifestation of a human order ordained by God and preaching to Black people that theirs was a glorified place among the chickens and the pigs. Wow. To most people along the Chpt River, January 1868 hardly seemed an auspicious time to marry. It was raw, cold, and hungry. In every direction, from the Cottenham Loop, the simple dirt road alongside which lived 3 generations of former slaves and their former owners. The land and its horizons were muted and bitter. The valley, the undulating hills of Bibb County, even the bridges and fords across the 100-year wide Chpt sweeping down from the last foothills of the Appalachians and into the flat, fertile plains to the south, were still wrecked from the savage cavalry raids of Union General James H. Wilson. Just 2 springs earlier, in April 1865, his horsemen had descended on Alabama in billowing swarms. The enfeebled Southern Army defending the state scattered before his advance. Even the great Confederate cavalry genius Nathan Bedford Forrest, his regiments eviscerated by 4 years of war, was swept aside with impunity. Wilson crushed the last functioning industrial complex of the Confederacy and left Alabama in a state of complete chaos. Not 3 years later, the valley remained a twisted ruin, fallow fields, burned barns, machinery rusting at the bottom of wells, horses and mules dead or lost, the people, Black and white, braced for a hard, anxious winter. Please to watch it. So this is now you got to understand why these Confederates were so bitter. So now we're reading into the aftermath of the war, like what they left these southern states with. These Southerners was pissed off, man. They were not happy with the national government for the Civil War and decimating them, setting them back so many years. I got a summertime cold. I don't know where this came. This is, my God, this is weird. From the front porch of Alicia Cottingham's house, 2 stories stacked of hand hewn logs and chinked with red clay dug at the river's edge, the old man looked out on his portion of the barren vista. The land had long ago lost nearly all resemblance to the massive exuberance of the frontier forest he stumbled upon 50 years earlier. Now, only the boundaries and contours remain of his carefully tended bounty of the last years before the war. He had picked this place for the angle of the land. It unfolded from the house in one long sheet of soil, falling gradually away from his rough plank front steps. For nearly 500 years, the slope descended smoothly toward the deep river, layered when Alicia first arrived with a foot fertile humus. On the east and south, the great field was hemmed in by gushing creek, boiled. Look at this. This is, boy, they paint the scene, right? The scenery. Boiling up over tortoiseshell shapes of limestone protruding from the banks, growing deeper and wider, falling faster and more furiously, strong enough to spin a small grist mill before it turned to the west and suddenly plunged into the Cahaba. He named the stream Cottingham Creek. An abounding sense of possibility exuded from the place Elisha had chosen, land on which he intuitively knew a resourceful man could make his own indelible mark. The grammar is funny, man. They're going to some old grammar here. Okay, can y'all modernize the damn grammar, man? So I can know what the hell I'm reading. Give me a second. Summertime cool. I gotta play ball today. Get rid of this damn cool. It's hot as heat. I got no choice. Anybody trying to be sick in summertime. All right. Yet in the aftermath of the war, Civil War, Elisha Cottingham, like countless other Southern whites in 1868, must have felt some dread sense of an atomized future. They knew that the perils of coming times constituted a far greater jeopardy than the war just lost. A society that had engineered from wilderness had been defeated and humiliated. The human livestock on which they had relied on for generations, what happened? The human livestock, which was stripped away from them by the Union soldiers, right? By the Civil War, in which they had relied on for generations, now threatened to rule in their place. I'm pretty sure that pissed them off. In the logical spectrum of possibilities for what might yet follow, Elisha had to consider the terrifying and ultimately realized possibility that all human effort invested at the confluence of Cottingham Creek and the Cahaba River would be erased. The alacrity, really never seen that word a day in my life, that infused their achievement was lost. More than a century later, the last Cottingham will be gone. This author really is expressing his education in his writing. None of the fields hacked from the forest remained at plow. Only the creek and some bleached gravestones clustered atop the hill still bore the Cottingham name. All right. Elisha had arrived at the banks of the Cahaba, barely a man himself, in an Alabama territory that was still untamed. It was 1817, and Elisha and his 3 brothers faced a dense wilderness governed by the uncertainties of Indian territory and the vagaries of an American nation debating the precepts of eminent domain that would ultimately expand its borders from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Alabama would not be a state for 2 more years. So it keeps stressing the wilderness, because some people clear that wilderness up. You're going to find out. Peace, Khalid. Elisha's brother, Charles, soon decamped to the newly founded county seat of Centerville, where in short order, shallow draft riverboats would land and a trading center would be established. Another brother, William, moved farther south, but Elisha and his younger sibling, John, stayed in the wilderness in the Kahaba in the 4 decades before the Civil War. They staked out land, brought in wives, cleared the lush woodlands, sired bountiful families, and planted season upon season of cotton. The engines of their enterprises were black slaves. In the early years, they imported them to Alabama and later bred more themselves, bred slaves, including Henry from the African stock they bought at auction or from peripatetic slave peddlers. Wow, another word I never read before in my life. Who arrived unbidden in springtime with traces of ragged, shackled black men and women carrying signs advertising Negroes for sale. This is before the Civil War. Manning Farm, strung along a looping wagon road. The brothers and their slaves cleared the land. Who? The slaves cleared the land. They kind of built in America at this point. All right. Raised cabins and built the church where they would pray, harnessing their black labor to the rich black land. The Cottingham brothers became prosperous and comfortable. So with the help of slave labor, free slave labor, the Cottingham brothers became prosperous and comfortable. These are the same Confederate freaks that tell you he ain't working hard enough. Some neighbors called the Cottingham section of the county Pratt's Ferry for the man who lived on the other side of the Kaaba and poled a raft across the water for a few pennies a ride. But the Cottinghams, God-fearing people, allegedly, who gathered a congregation of Methodists in the wilderness almost as soon as they had felled the first timber, adopted for their homestead and name marking the work not of a man, but of the Almighty. Where the clear cold creek gurgled into the Kaaba, a massive bulge of limestone rose from the water, imposing itself over a wide sweeping curve in the river. To the Cottinghams, this place was riverbed. The Cottinghams demanded a harsh life of labor from their bondsmen. All right, you already got free labor. Now I'm gonna do the harsh life thing. Otherwise, what point was there to the tremendous investment required of owning slaves? Yet, especially in contrast to the industrial slavery that would a bit by mosquito that would eventually bud nearby. Life on the Cottingham plantation reflected the biblical understanding that cruelty to any creature was a sin, that black slaves, even not quite men, were at least thinly made in the image of God. Set among more than 20 barns and other farm buildings, Henry and the rest of the slaves lived in crude but warm cabins built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. Heat came from rock fireplaces with chimneys made of sticks and mud. Elisha recorded the ownership of 13 slaves in 1860, including 4 men in their 20s and 30s and 6 other male teenagers. A single 20-year-old female lived among the slaves, along with 2 young boys and a 17-year-old girl. Given the traditions of isolated rural farms, Elisha's grandson Oliver, raised there on the Cottingham farm, would have been a lifelong playmate of the slave boy nearly his same age, named Henry. When Elisha Cottingham's daughter, Rebecca, married a neighbor, Benjamin Battle, in 1852, Elisha presented to her as a wedding gift the slave girl who likely had been her companion and servant. Quote, in consideration of the natural love and affection which I bear to my daughter, Elisha wrote, I give her a certain Negro girl named Frances, about 14 years old. There you go. Here's your wedding gift, a slave girl. Those slaves who died on the Cottingham place were buried with neat ceremony and plots, marked by rough, unlabeled stones just a few feet from Elisha himself will be laid to rest in 1870. Clearly acknowledged as members in some manner of a larger human family recognized by the master, indeed, Elisha buried his slaves near to him by far than he did Reverend Starr, the man who ministered to all the souls on the Cottingham Place. The Starr family plot, with its evangelical inscriptions and sad roster of infant dead, was set down the hill and toward the road, even more vulnerable to the creeping oblivion of time. Long generations hence, descendants of slaves from the plantation still recounted a vague legend of the generosity of a Cottingham master, giving permission to marry to a favorite mulatto named Green, the slave who would remain at Elisha's side past emancipation and until the old master's death, would become the namesake of Henry and Mary's youngest son. But even Elisha had allowed a strain of tenderness to co-reside with the brutality circumscribed lives of his slaves. He never lost sight of their fundamental definition as cattle, right? They were creatures bought or bred for the production of wealth, right? So he never lost sight of why he has these slaves, not for companion, not to be cool, but he remembered that they were creatures bought or bred for the production of wealth. Even as he deeded to daughter Rebecca, the slave Frances, Elisha was careful to enumerate in the document the recognition that he was giving up not just one slave girl, but a whole line of future stock who might have brought him cash or labor. Along with Frances, Elisha was careful to specify his newlywed daughter received all future increase of the girl. The marriage of Henry, now 20 years old, and Mary, 1 year his junior, in 1868, was the first among Cottingham people, black or white, in 2 seasons. Another slave, Albert, had wed and left for good in the middle of the first picking time after the destruction of the war. Amid the chaos and uncertainty when no one could be sure slavery had truly ended, Albert didn't want to wait to find out. He was gone. Now, 2 years later, the coming marriage surely warmed Elisha at some level. But as Henry prepared to take a wife and become a man of this particular new era, everything the old white man had forged, everything on him which that gift to his daughter 20 years before had been predicated, hung in the fragile limbo of a transformed social order. Whatever satisfaction in the filial ties gave the white master at the wedding of his former bondsman would have been tempered by the poverty and grief that had overwhelmed him. Get my nose real quick. Making X on the bike. Here, Black, read. All right, it's about to get deep. This is some good information here. It's from the Civil War, World War II, right? Okay, so let me make sure I'm not reading the same thing over, which I was gonna do. Gotta stop myself. Okay. All right, I got it. Most of Elisha's slaves remained nearby. This is after the Civil War, after Emancipation Proclamation. Some still worked his property for wages or a share of the cotton crop. But the end of the war had left the white Cottinghams at a point of near desolation. The hard winter threatened to bring them to their knees. As Henry and Mary's wedding approached in 1868, whites across the South strained to accept their apparently inevitable ignominies descending from the war. Ignominies, wow. The loss of fortunes, right? The loss of fortunes, the war's blood and sorrow, the humiliation of of Union soldiers encamped in their town. So they was humiliated with the Union soldiers in their town, like occupying it, you know, just rub it in their face. And you best believe they can't do anything with Union soldiers. So they're looking at the black defensive slaves like, all right, we're going to take it out on y'all. It's y'all fault. But the cowards. But they ain't going to holler at the guy with the gun, though. Union soldiers encamped in their towns. All these things whites had come to bear. They would bear them a little longer, at least until the instant threats of hunger and military force receded, right? But these abominations paled against the specter that former slaves, with their huge mathematical majorities in Louisiana, Mississippi, Southern Alabama, South Georgia, and South Carolina, would soon vote and rule governments and perhaps take their master's land. So what happened? They would soon vote and rule governments and perhaps take their master's lands. All right. The vision was a horror almost beyond contemplation. So this was the fear of these whites, poor whites that took the L. It poisoned the air for Elisha and other white landowners with prospects for even greater disaster. In the last days of fighting, the U.S. Congress had created the Freedmen's Bureau to aid the South's emancipated slaves. New laws gave the agency the power to divide land confiscated by the federal government and to have not more than 40 acres of such land. Got it? Read that over. In the last days of fighting, the U.S. Congress had created the Freedmen's Bureau to aid the South's emancipated slaves. New laws gave the agency the power to divide land confiscated, it means government took it, by the federal government and to have, quote, not more than 40 acres of such land, assigned, end quote, to freedmen and Black war refugees for a period of 3 years. I'm sure the losers were mad at that. Afterward, the law said former slaves would be allowed to purchase the property to hold forever. President Andrew Johnson rescinded the provision a few months later, but emancipated slaves across the South remained convinced that Northern soldiers still garrisoned across the region would eventually parcel out to them all or part of the land on which they had long toiled. The threat that Elisha's former slaves would come to his own plantation, that he and his family would be landless, stripped of possessions, and outnumbered by the very creatures he had bred and raised was palpable. Wow. This author wants to really express his education. The last desperate rallying calls of the Confederacy, have been exhortations that a Union victory meant the political and economic subjugation of whites to their Black slaves. And one of the final acts of the Confederate Congress, rebel legislators asserted that defeat would result in the confiscation of the estates, which would be given to their former bondsmen. That was a quote. So this is the beginning of like the scientific racism. Like they're just spreading all these like propaganda lies and, you know, trying to get an outcry, trying to get a mob of whites to respond a certain way. They're expressing their deepest crazy fears. Already 40,000 former slaves, 40,000 former slaves have been given title by General William Tecumseh Sherman to 400,000 acres of rich plantation land in South Carolina in early 1865. Okay. It was unclear whether Blacks would be able to retain any of the property, but what did they get? Already 40,000 former slaves had been given title by General William Tecumseh Sherman to 400,000 acres of rich plantation land in South Carolina in early 1865. It was unclear whether Blacks would be able to retain any of the property, but rumor flared anew among Blacks across the South the next year at Christmas time, the end of the annual crop season, that plantation land everywhere will be soon distributed among them. The U.S. Congress debated such a plan openly in 1867 as it drew up the statutes to govern Reconstruction in the southern states. And again, as harvest time ended that year, word whipped through the countryside that blacks would soon have land. You know what's funny? Because when the topic of reparations, circulate today, it's like it's really non-tangible stuff. They ain't saying give them land. Like, you see how he was trying to repair black folks after the Civil War? Land, 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 land. Now it's like intangible stuff. Here, take this, but it's nothing physical. All right. What is better than having land? At one point the following year, in 1868, during a period of intense speculation among free slaves that land was soon to be provided to them, many blacks purchased boundary markers to be prepared for the marking off of their 40-acre tracts. 40 miles to the west of the Cottingham farm in Greene County, hundreds of former slaves filed suit against white landowners in 1868, demanding that former slave masters be compelled to pay wages earned during the prior season's work. Whites responded by burning down the courthouse, and with it, all 1,800 lawsuits filed by the freedmen. So let's keep it G. Let's keep it G here. I told you that this country was divided. White folks were divided here. You're reading the division yourself, or you're hearing me read the division itself. Whites trying to get black folks land. Other white folks saying, hell no. They burned the whole courthouse down and all of the 1,800 filed lawsuits. Despite Bibb County's remote location, far from any of the most famous military campaigns, the Civil War had not been a distant event. In the early months of fighting, Alabama industrialists realized that the market for iron sufficient for armaments will become lucrative in the South. In 1860, only Tredegar Iron Works, a vast industrial enterprise in Richmond, Virginia, driven by more than 450 slaves and nearly as many free laborers, could produce battle-ready cannon for the South. The Confederate government, almost from the moment of its creation, set out to spur additional capacity to make arms, particularly in Alabama, where a nascent iron and coal industry was already emerging and little fighting was likely to occur. During the war, a dozen or more new iron furnaces were put into blast in Alabama. By 1864, the state was pumping out 4 times more iron than any other southern state. Across Alabama, individual property holders, slaveholders specifically, were aggressively encouraged to attempt primitive industrial efforts to support the Confederate war effort. The rebel government offered generous inducements to entrepreneurs and large slave owners to devote their resources to the South's industrial needs. With much of the major plantation areas of Mississippi under constant federal harassment, thousands of slaves there were without work. Slave owners willing to transport their black workers to the new mining regions of Alabama and dig coal could avoid conscription into the Southern armies. One more time. Slave owners willing to transport their black workers to the new mining regions of Alabama and dig coal could avoid conscription into the Southern armies. After seeing their homes and stockpiles of cotton burned, W.H. and Lewis Thompson, brothers from Hinds County, Mississippi, and the owners of large number of slaves, moved to Bibb County midway through the war to mine the Cahaba coal fields. So they're mining coal for the Confederacy. They opened the Lower Thompson mine, and later another relative and his slaves arrived to dig another mine. The coal was hauled 11 miles to Ashby and then shipped to Selma. The mining was crude, using picks and hand-pulled carts. The slaves drained water from the shafts by carrying buckets up to the surface. A neighbor of the Cottingham's local farm, Oliver Frost, regularly took his slaves to a cave on 6 Mile Creek to mine saltpeter, a critical ingredient for gunpowder. So the slaves are doing a lot of mining here for the Confederate Army, often remaining there for weeks at a time. The Fancher family, on a farm 3 miles north of the Crossroads community called 6 Mile, regularly hauled limestone from a quarry on their property to a Bibb County furnace during the war. The centerpiece of the Alabama military enterprises was a massive and heavily fortified arsenal, naval foundry, ironworks, and gunpowder mill located in the city of Selma. To produce weapons and melting plating for use on ironclad ships, critical to the Confederacy's limited naval operations, the Selma works relied on enormous amounts of coal and iron ore, mined and forged in near Shelby, and Bibb counties. Alabama iron was particularly well suited to use in the revolutionary new development of fortifying battleships with steel plates. Iron forged at Alabama's King Creek furnace in Calhoun County has been utilized for a portion of the armor used to convert the hull of the captured USS Merrimac into the CSS Virginia, the southern entrant in the famous March 1862 Battle of Ironclads. The Confederacy was hungry for as much of the material as it can get. Of particular strategic value were ironworks established by local investors in 1862 in the village of Briarfield, 9 miles from the Cottingham place. The Briarfield Ironworks produced the plates that adorned the Confederate vessel CSS Tennessee, which during the Battle of Mobile Bay on August 5th, 1864, withstood the barrage of 17 Union vessels without a single shot penetrating her hull. Bibb County iron quickly became a coveted material. As the war escalated, maintaining production required an ever-increasing number of slaves. Agents from major factories, Burnfield Iron and the Shelby Iron Works, scoured the countryside to buy or lease African Americans. Foundries routinely commissioned labor agents to prowl across the southern states in search of available slaves. In 1863, the Confederate government purchased the Briarfield operation for $600,000 so that it could directly control its output. The purchase encompassed its property of all kinds whatsoever, including thousands of acres of land and a catalog of dozens of wagons, wheelbarrows, coal sleds, axes, and blacksmith tools. On the list of livestock were 70 mules, 41 oxen, get ready for it, and 9 black men. That was the livestock. John Anderson, aged about 35, Dennis about 38, George about 30, Charles in charge about 47, Perry Mason about 40, Chef Curry with the pop boy, Curry's about 17, Matthew about 35, Mose about 18, and Esquire about 30 years. The Confederate government began construction of a second furnace at the site shortly after acquiring the property. All of this output went to the Selma Arsenal, 50 miles by railroad to the south, where the iron was used for armor and for naval guns, including the state-of-the-art 11-inch Brooke rifle cannon, with a capacity of firing 230-pound shell more than 2,000 yards. By the standards of the antebellum South, the Briarfield Ironworks was a spectacle of industrial wonder. The adjacent village held church in a schoolhouse surrounded by the tenements and small housing for 300 workers. 2 massive brick blast furnaces, each 40 feet high, belched a thick brew of smoke and gases at the top and a torrent of liquefied iron at the base. Nearby was a rolling mill with the molten iron. Hold on. Didactagon, the Automan, the Monroe Doctrine, the Spheres of Influence. Okay, I go now. Did I lose my place? All right. I know where I'm at. Nearby was a rolling mill where the molten iron was formed into crude 100-pound pigs for shipment to Selma and loaded onto a railroad line extended into the factory yard. 100 yards away sat a kiln for firing limestone, 10 tons of which was fed each day into the furnaces. Beyond the kiln was a quarry for the endless task of repairing the stone furnaces, a sawmill, and then 7,000 acres of forest from which fuel for the constantly burning fires was cut. So keep in mind, this is a book about African people, right? Right after emancipated Black people. And you still got to learn about America. Like, there's no way just to cherry pick and just learn Black folks and that's it, and skip around the Confederacy and all that type of stuff. Look, you're forced to. I read this yesterday. Well, other stuff, but it's tied into Black history. Black history in America is white history. White history in America is Black history. You got to read both. The 9 slaves owned by the ironworks were an anomaly. Few industrial enterprises wanted to actually purchase slaves. The 9 slaves owned by the ironworks were an anomaly. Few industrial enterprises wanted to actually purchase slaves. So few industrial enterprises wanted to actually purchase slaves. Okay? They wanted to lease them. They were too expensive at acquisition and too costly and difficult to maintain. What happened? Slaves, to own a slave, it was too expensive at acquisition, acquiring them, taxes and all type of stuff, bidding, and too costly and difficult to maintain. Food, make sure they're healthy, take care of them. So slavery was expensive, okay? Too unpredictable as to when they might become uncooperative or die. So you never knew when somebody's gonna rebel or just drop dead. Far preferable to the slave era industrialists was to lease the slave chattel owned by other men. Industrialists said, we just want to lease them. We don't want to own them at all. We just want to borrow for our cause and send them back. You take care of them, you house them, you do all that. In 1864, however, few such workers could be found anywhere. Instead, the Confederate officer commanding the Beerfield Iron Production Operation, Maj. William Richardson Hunt, rented 200 slaves to perform the grueling task necessary to continue equipping the rebel army. Late in the war, as the need for the area's coal and iron capacity grew dire, the Confederate government began to forcibly impress the slaves held by whites in the county. A son of Reverend Stars, a doctor and also a resident of the Cottingham Loop, became the government's agent for seizing slaves. There is no surviving record of which Black men were pressed into service, but by war's end, Scipio Cottingham, the 63-year-old slave who had shared the farm longest with Master Elisha, had come to identify himself as a foundry man. Almost certainly, he had been among those rented to the Beerfield furnace and compelled to help arm the troops fighting to preserve his enslavement. Wow. 1 second. Oh, man. Where's my elderberry? Damn it. Echinacea. All right. As the war years progressed, ever larger numbers of local men from near the Cottingham farm left for battle duty, Two of Elisha's sons fought for the Confederacy, Moses and James, both husbands and fathers. Each saw gruesome action, personal injury, and captured by the Union. Elisha's grandson, Oliver, too young to fight with the troops, joined the Home Guard, the ragtag platoons of old men and teenagers whose job was to patrol the roads for deserters, fleeing slaves, and Union scouts. In the beginning, large crowds gathered at the stores in the crossroads settled of 6 Mile to send them off, and groups of women worked together to sew the uniforms they wore. Soldiers on the move through the area were a regular sight, crossing the Cahaba on the ferry near the mouth of Cottingham Creek and traversing the main road from there toward the rail towns to the east. Confederate soldiers camped often on the Cottingham farm, stretching out in the big field near the river, foraging from the plantation supplies and food, exchanging spent horses for fresh ones. At one point, late, that's a car maintenance, switch the horse. At one point, late in the war, an entire regiment set camp in the field, erecting tents and lighting cooking fires. The appearance of Confederate soldiers must have been an extraordinary event in the lives of Black members of the Cottingham clan. The war years were a conflicted period of confused roles for slaves. They were the subjects of the Union's Army War of Liberation and the victims of the South's economic system. Yet at the time, slaves were also servants and protectors of their white masters. That's like a conflict of interest there. In the woods near the Cottingham home, slaves guarded the horses and possessions of their white owners, hidden there to avoid raids of northern soldiers. Some slaves took the opportunity to flee, but most stayed at their posts until true liberation came in the spring of 1865. Some slaves say, you know what? That horse right there, yeah, we out of here. The foundry and arsenal at Selma and the simple mines and furnaces around the Cottingham farm that supplied it with raw materials had taken on outsized importance as the war dragged on. The Alabama manufacturing network became the backbone of the Confederacy's ability to make arms, as the treasure factories were depleted of raw materials and skilled workers and menaced by the advancing armies of Ulysses S. Grant. Preservation of the Alabama enterprises was a key element of a last-ditch plan by Jefferson Davis, the Southern president, to retreat with what was left of the Confederate military into the Deep South and continue the war. For more than a year, Union forces, hold that thought. Yeah, that's an interesting role. Like your job is to take care of your master, but the other side trying to get rid of your master. So you like, damn, what do I do? Because you want the master gone, essentially. But your whole life you were trained to protect him. I read that. Oh, I'm here. For more than a year, Union forces in southern Tennessee and northern Alabama massed for an anticipated order to obliterate any continued capacity of a rump Confederate government to make arms. Small groups of horse soldiers made regular probing raids as minimum Southern resistance. In April 1864, Alabama's governor wired Confederate Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk, commander of rebel forces in Alabama and Mississippi, imploring him to send additional troops. The enemy's forces are fortifying their position with their cavalry, raiding over the country. It is certain that the forces will work way south and destroy the valuable works in central Alabama. Can nothing be done? Finally, in March 1865, a mass of 13,500 Union cavalrymen swept down from the Tennessee border in one of the North's penultimate death blows to the rebellion. Commanded by General James H. Wilson, the Union Army, well drilled and amplified arms, split into three huge raiding parties, each assigned to destroy key elements of Alabama's industrial infrastructure. Moving unchallenged for days, the federal troops, federal troops, burned or wrecked iron, forge, mills. So who is doing this to the South? To the Confederates? Huh? Federal troops. Anti-Federalists, you dig? So who are the Anti-Federalists? Federal troops burned or wrecked iron forges, mills, and massive stockpiles of cotton and coal in Red Mountain, Irondale, and Helena, north of Bibb County. On the morning of March 30th, Union soldiers slogged down the rain-drenched roads into Columbiana, destroying the machinery of the Shelby Ironworks, shoving its equipment into local wells and streams, and freeing the slaves critical to its operations. Again, nearly hopeless odds. Nathan Bedford Forrest, a former slave dealer who had become the South's most storied horseman, met the blue advance at a point south of the town of Montevallo. Skirmishing along like a rat, skirmishing along Mahon Creek, just miles from the Cottingham farm, Forrest's disorganized command could only harass Wilson's advance. Northern troops took the Briarfield Furnace on March 31st and left it a ruin. Outmanned and outfought, with flooding creeks blocking his maneuvers. Forrest, himself slashed by a saber in savage fighting on April 1st, retreated for a final stand at Selma. The next day, Wilson troops charged the fortified industrial complex in Selma and routed Forrest's remaining 4,000 men. The Confederate general slipped away with an escort of 100 soldiers, massacring as he made his escape most of contingent of 25 sleeping Union scouts he stumbled upon in a field. Federal forces captured nearly 3,000 of Forrest's men, along with more than 60 pieces of field cannon, scores of heavy artillery guns, 9 factories, 5 major iron forges, 3 foundries, 20 locomotives, immense quantities of military supplies, and 35,000 bales of cotton. The arsenal, factory shops, and foundries of Selma were systematically destroyed. Perhaps most shocking to local whites, before moving on to attack Georgia, Wilson's officers quickly raised a 1,000-man regiment of Black troops placed under the command of the 3rd Ohio Cavalry. With the remaining Confederate armies, commanded by General Robert E. Lee and General Joseph E. Johnson, unable to unite, Jefferson Davis hopes to continue the rebellion as a guerrilla struggle collapsed. Cut off from his remaining troops, his Alabama munitions system destroyed, deprived of the last regions of relative security in the South. He attempted to flee to Texas or Mexico under hot pursuit by detachments of General Wilson's troops. He was captured by Union forces in Georgia weeks later. The war came finally to its end. Alabama has suffered losses totaling $500 million, a sum beyond comprehension in 1865. Guess who they're mad at? Yes, they hate the Federalists, and they damn sure hate the slaves that were free, that had nothing to do with it. The total value of farm property was reduced during the war for $250 million to less than $98 million, including the loss of slaves. All banks in the state had collapsed. All banks. Agricultural production levels would not match that of 1860 for another 40 years. Done. But the final days of the war proved to be only the beginning of a more inexorable and anarchic struggle. A vicious white insurgency. A vicious white insurgency against the Union occupation and the specter of Black citizenship began to take shape, presaged by the conduct of home guard patrols like the one Oliver Cottham had joined. The patrols, uncoordinated and increasingly contemptuous of any authority during the war, had become to be known as more bandits and thugs. Had become to be more known as bandits and thugs than defenders of the Confederacy. Huh? The patrols, uncoordinated and increasingly contemptuous of any authority during the war, had become to be known more as bandits and thugs than defenders of the Confederacy. Who are the bandits and thugs without leadership? Who are the bandits? Who are the bandits and thugs without proper leadership? The Confederate defenders. After 4 years of conscriptions, verging on kidnappings, violence perpetrated against critics of rebellion, and ruthless seizures of supplies and property, the Home Guard was in many places as despised as the Yankee troops. But in the aftermath of a sudden, and in much of the South, unanticipated surrender, no clear central authority existed in the domestic affairs of places too small or remote to warrant a detachment of Northern troops. In the Deep South, that meant nearly every place outside state capitals and economic centers. Ron King. So make sure to matriculate. Funny. Hey, so make sure you mind these crazy whites who were the first thugs. So these thugs were before even Italian mafia. They were the Confederates. All right. The result in the 2 years preceding Henry and Mary's wedding was a spreading wave of internecine violence and thievery by returning Confederate soldiers, particularly against those Southerners who had doubted the war. Deserters who have been far more numerous than Southern mythology acknowledged began settling old scores. The increasing lawlessness, what? The increasing lawlessness, all these sovereigns of the post-war years was, rather than a wave of crime by freed slaves as so often claimed, largely perpetrated against whites by other whites. So there's propaganda that there was increasing lawlessness after the war, right? Rather than a wave of crime by free slaves as so often claimed. So the scientific racism was that it was the slaves for all the crime, but instead it was whites against other whites. It was white on white crime. Okay? White on white crime. Heavy. Post the war. Blamed on the free slaves. So when you see what we came from, right? When you see what we came from, what we've been through, this is why I get upset at Black people today. Like I have like zero tolerance, because when I read this, I see how much like negativity is poured on us, unwarranted. Minstrel shows and worse. This is before minstrel shows. And then we go ahead and willingly take on these roles, willingly shoot each other down, and don't want to hold each other accountable. We want to just blame white supremacy, blame. No accountability. Well, if you do that, then you're pretty much bonding to the racial stereotypes that we're feeble-minded. Like we can't find our own way. We need some white slave master to guide us right. Left to our own devices, we just fuck up and blame everybody. Okay. The Cottingham farm sat in the middle of this unrest. One gang of deserters in Bibb County, made up of men believed to have abandoned the armies of both the North and the South, called themselves the Uglies. I swear that's what it says. Called themselves the Uglies and marauded through the countryside during the war, robbing farms and threatening Confederate supporters. Another gang, so they're a bunch of gangs, man, just ganged up. Another gang inhabited the Yellow Leaf Swamp on the border with adjoining Chilton County. A paramilitary band of men near the town of Montevallo calling itself Blackwell's cavalrymen, hunted the countryside for Confederate deserters before the Southern surrender and continued as an outlaw gang after the war. So you had whites hunting down whites. You had, it looked like Union supporters, militiaing up and going after these Confederates, straight bounty style, straight predator style. All right. Where am I? The group eventually murdered a total of 17 local men. White lawlessness was so rampant, White lawlessness was so rampant in Shelby County that less than a year before Henry and Mary's wedding, Union military officials in the Alabama capital threatened to send troops into the area to restore peace. So, all you blackologists that want to shame white folks and show them like shameful history of their past, I'm giving you ammunition now. But instead, you want to go to government conspiracies, injections, anti-vaxxers, Kanan, all this stupid foolishness. Lawlessness whites. So bad the Union was like, all right, man, go back in and civilize them, man. They are bugging out. He said Moors. Yeah, where are the Moors at right now? I bet you Moors weren't trying to travel now. They don't try to travel. Chilton County had been a hotbed of such guerrilla activity throughout the war and emerged as a refuge for Confederate deserters and Southerners who remained loyal to the Union. A local plantation owner, Captain James Cobb, who had been sent home from duty with the Southern Army due to poor health, was assigned the task of breaking up the gangs of deserters, white folks. The effort spawned vendettas that would outlast the war. On June 3rd, 1865, nearly 2 months after the surrender, Cobb was seized by a group of 30 whites and hanged from a tree on his property. You know that? It was catching these the white folks, they be all in. When it come to war, bro, they are cutthroat. They hung this white fool on his own property. Afterward, they ransacked his home, killing or stealing his livestock. The former Confederate officer was accused of having named 7 of the mob's members as deserters. The Blackwell group subsequently captured the 7 and summarily executed them. Of the handful of Union soldiers sent to Bibb County to oversee a nominal local court system during the first 2 years after the war, one was killed on a Centerville street corner by a Confederate veteran wielding an axe handle. 2 agents of the Freedmen's Bureau were assigned to the area in January and February of 1866. The men named Beard and Higginbotham were promptly whipped by local whites and driven from the county. Not long after, rumors spread that 2 former slaves named Tom Johnson and Rube Russell had been seen around the county sporting fine clothes paid by, don't wear those fine clothes, supporting 2 slaves were seen around the county sporting fine clothes paid for by Freedmen Bureau's agents. The emancipated slaves planned to live like white folks and marry white wives. Oh, no. Indigenous is going to take that and run with it. According to a newspaper account, Johnson was promptly hanged from a tree on Market Street a few mornings later. Don't you wear no fine clothes. Passerby found Russell dangling dead in a tree not far from the scene of the earlier lynching. Yep, there you go. Yet, even as Southern whites like those in Bibb County made their rejection of the new order so apparent, no alternative was clear either. The loss of slaves left white farm families, such as the Cottinghams, and even more so those on expansive plantations with scores or hundreds of slaves, not just financially, but intellectually bereft. The slaves were the true experts in the task of cotton production, on most farms. In many cases, it was slaves who directed the gangs or other slaves in their daily work. Slavery had been introduced into the southern colonies in the 1600s with the argument that whites operating alone were incapable of large-scale cotton production. They were they didn't have the school, they didn't have the skills. The concepts of sharecropping and farm tenancy hadn't yet evolved. The notion that their farms could be operated in some manner other than with groups of black laborers compelled by a landowner or his overseer to work as many as 20 hours a day was antithetical to most whites. Hold on, let me look that word up. Not letting that go. Okay, they just been rocking with it. Moreover, the sudden willingness of millions of black laborers to insolently demand cash wages and other requirements to secure their labor was an almost otherworldly experience for whites such as Elisha Cunningham. For blacks, like, yo, cut the check. I'll do it, but cut the check. Former slaves were suddenly mobile too, seeking new lodging away from the farms of their slave lives and attempting to put white farmers into competition with one another for their work. Damn. In the absence of any means to supply free slaves with land, the Freedmen's Bureau and Northern military commanders stationed in the South encouraged blacks to enter into labor contracts with whites. Right? Monica Lamb, I like that. Federal contract or government contracts. The results were written agreements between whites and blacks farmhands filled with provisions aimed at restoring the subjugated state of African Americans, right? So the contracts, the results were written agreements between whites and blacks, white and black farmhands filled with provisions aimed at restoring the subjugated state of African Americans. One agent of the Freedmen's Bureau wrote that whites were unable to fathom that work, quote, could be accomplished without some prodigious binding and obligating of the hireling to the employer, end quote. Some white plantation owners attempted to coerce their former slaves into signing lifetime contracts. No, don't do that Bob Arum contract. To work on the farms. In one South Carolina case in 1865, when 4 freedmen refused such agreements, 2 were killed and a third, a woman, was tortured. Damn. So they tried to give them the Bob Arum contract and they didn't want it, killed 2 of them and tortured the woman. More common were year-to-year contracts that obligated black workers to remain throughout a plantation and harvest season to receive their full pay. Damn. And under which they agreed to extraordinarily and numerous limitations on personal freedom that echoed slave laws in effect before emancipation. They agreed not to leave the landowner's property without a written pass, not to own firearms, a Second Amendment, to obey all commands, that Bible, of the farmer or his overseer, to speak in servile manner, and in the event of a violation of the rules to accept whatever punishment the farmer deemed appropriate, often the last. Yeah, I bet. Most of the early contracts adopted in the South in 1865 and 1866 were dissolved by commanders of the occupying Union troops, but they framed a strategy that Southern whites would return to again and again. When Alicia's son arrived home from the war, they found only the barest gleanings of their earlier time with which to restart lives. The thriving farmland world of their boyhoods no longer existed. After 4 years of steadily inflated Confederate script, now entirely worthless, the value of a man's land and tools, even a bale of cotton, was nearly unknowable. Alicia's property was worth the substantial sum of nearly $20,000 before the war. The great bulk of that was invested in his slaves, and now they were no more his. Cottingham had not even the cash to buy cotton seed and corn. He couldn't re-up, much less the labor of the former slaves they had so recently owned. So he didn't have money to reinvest, to start all over, and he had no money to employ any slaves that wanted that check cut. Look at who's mad at the union, at the federal government. So when I read what I read yesterday, you see the pieces of the puzzle start to go fit perfectly. Okay, federal government can't do no right, according to these people who supported the Confederate States. That's what I gathered. All right. They time traveling. All right, so let's continue. Man, I'm trying to be. That's why I can only do one chapter. God, yo, God damn, bro, when this thing gonna end? Oh, hell no. Oh boy. All right. In February 1868, Elisha, one chapter is pretty long. Elisha, perhaps sensing his own mortality more acutely in the post-war chaos, began dividing much of the plantation among his four sons, John, James, Moses, and Harry. At the same time, his daughter Rebecca Battle bought 200 acres of the property for $600. Later that month, Moses Cottingham borrowed $120 from a cotton buyer in the town of Randolph, an outpost in the other end of the county on the edge of the wide open cotton lands of southern Alabama. For collateral, Moses promised two 500-pound bale of cotton at the end of the season. From another man, he borrowed 120 again, securing that note with one 6-year-old mule and a 10-year-old horse. The following January, 1869, Moses borrowed again. All right, so he ain't being redlined. He must got good credit. Moses borrowed again, mortgaging for $150 his ever older horse and 3 other mules. The crop that fall wouldn't be enough to pay off the loan, and Moses couldn't clear his debt until 1871. A sense of paralysis was pervasive among whites. Elias Bishop, a prosperous farmer with a spread of several hundred acres under plow in another rich bend of the Cahaba downstream from the Cottingham, was in similar straits. In the fall of 1869, Bishop, South Carolina, born and another of the county's earliest settlers, borrowed a little more than $50 against 100 bushels of corn and mortgaged a portion of his land for $37.60. He never paid it back. Yeah, you can't fish your credit, my man. You better highlight these credit people. The next summer, wife Sarah Bishop borrowed $150 against 2 pails of cotton from John C. Henry, the cotton buyer at Randolph, who had become the county's de facto banker and financier. She settled the debt after the harvest of 1870, but immediately had to assume another loan. The bishops, like Elisha and his family, were devout Wesleyan Methodists. Along with their slaves, the bishops had attended the Mount Zion Church near the farm in the south end of the county, where their family lived in a house overflowing with daughters. The bishops and Cottingham, white and black, would have known each other well through the close-knit circles of the Methodist circuit, their religion. John Wesley Starr, as a circuit riding clergyman, was a regular feature before both congregations. Elias Bishop had accumulated an even more impressive collection of slaves than Elisha, with 10 black men and 3 black families old enough to work in the fields at the beginning of the war. A half dozen young children rounded out the slave quarters. On the day of emancipation in 1863, the bishop slave girl named Mary, who 5 years later would become Henry Cottingham's wife, was 14. In the wake of the war, one episode in the lives of white Cottinghams became the defining antidote of the family's suffering and resurrection. And always gotta be some. Oh boy. All right. Elisha's son Moses had migrated to Bentonville Parish, Louisiana, a few years before secession, lost his land and the life of his wife, and had been forced to send his children on a harrowing journey through the battle zones of Mississippi with only a slave and a geriatric preacher to protect them. The saga resonated through generations of white Cottenhams and blacks descended from their slaves. After Moses enlisted in 1862 January, his pregnant wife, Nancy Catherine, okay, grew ill and then died during childbirth. So she died during childbirth. Moses returned home from the front to bury Nancy and make arrangements for their 6 surviving children. Elisha Cottingham sent a Baptist minister to Louisiana to bring his grandchildren back to Alabama. Hold on for me, my nose. God, can't even read. All right. Moses returned home from the front to bury Nancy and make arrangements for their 6 surviving children. Elisha Cottingham sent a Baptist minister to Louisiana to bring his grandchildren back to Alabama for the duration of the war. With the Southern railroad system already in shambles and most trains impressed into military service, the preacher and one of Moses' 2 slaves, Joe, set out in an ox-drawn wagon. That was the hardest trial I ever had to go through, to leave my little children to be carried off to Alabama. That's a quote. Moses recounted to descendants years later. For 3 weeks, the odd expedition inched across the war-disrupted South. The preacher and the old African American, a scramble of children foraging for turnip and cornmeal. The youngest daughter, Serena, still a child herself, feeding 2-month-old Johnny, the infant whose birth had killed their mother, with a gruel of basket sweet potatoes. In November 1862, the ragged band arrived at Elisha Cottingham's farm on the Cahaba River. The fate of Moses, still at war, was unknown. We never knew whether he was dead or alive till one day after the war was over, we saw him incoming. Serena later wrote, Moses started over, resettling on nearby land along Copper's Creek, marrying the daughter of another former slaveholding family and begetting another 7 children. Damn. The losses suffered by Moses and the slow rescue of his family in the heat of the war could have been a parable for how white Southerners perceived the destruction of the South they had known. Physical and financial devastation, death, and grief, followed by a transforming struggle to survive and rebuild. But the story also underscored the terrifying vulnerability whites like the Cottingham discovered in being forced to place the fate and future of Moses' family in the hands of a descendant of Africa. After the war, as the Cottingham slaves brazenly asserted their independence, the journey of Joe and the children across the South came to symbolize a reliance on Blacks that Southern whites could never again allow. Regardless of their intertwined past, the rehabilitation of the South by whites would not just purposely exclude Blacks. Regardless of their intertwined past, the rehabilitation of the South by whites would not just purposely exclude Blacks. As time passed and opportunity permitted, former slaves would be compelled to perform the rebuilding of the South as well in a system of labor hardly distinguishable in its brutality and coercion from the old slavery that preceded it. If one looked out from Elisha's porch in December 1868 across the crop rows and down past the creek, the only green in any nearby colorless winter landscape was in the short, scruffy needles of twisted cedars he had planted. long ago along the wagon drive from the road to the house. The slave cabins, nearly 2 dozen of them, were mostly empty now. Even Scipio, the old man's slave who had worked Alicia's farm nearly as long as the white master himself, was gone down the road. Already weather and uselessness were doing the shacks in. Crisp brown leaves heaped at the feet of a line of high pines and bare hickories that framed the boundaries of the main field between the river and the house. The walls of yellow limestone rising up abruptly from the eastern bank of the Cahaba looked pale and gray. The big field, long devoid of its hardwood forest, was stripped with lifeless rows of cotton stalks and corn husks standing against the low, sharp angled rays of winter sun. In every direction, thousands of bedraggled slips of lint clung to broken cotton balls, wisps of that portion of the harvest that time and weather and Alicia's mind, the obstinacy of his new Negroes, had conspired to leave behind. They conspired. All winter long, they would hang there, limp and wet, layered in dead fields with a hazy whisper of white and golding Alicia Cottingham in their wake. Yeah, so these Southerners was pissed. And they felt like the slaves betrayed them. Like they were delusional to believe that they had like a real relationship with the slaves. Like the slaves just accepted this docile, this livestock, and they were content with it. Like they really thought the slaves didn't mind being livestock. Okay. How differently lay the land for Henry Cottingham and Mary Bishop. They had been reared on farms within a night's walk of the plain country church, where now they were married. And the hills and fields and forests fanning out from the Cahaba eastward a long 6 mile road had been the width and range of life to these two slaves, contrasted against the circumscribed existence, the extraordinary events, and the aftermath of emancipation, no matter the deprivation or rudeness, must have been bathed in a glow of wonder and astonishment. Okay, a little pause right there. My eyes starting to get blurry. A little gathering moment. Reset. And the flies gonna come outside. Piss me off. Let me rest my eyes for a couple of seconds here. So I left off on page where am I? Oh, top of page 31. All right, all right, all right, all right. Whew, that's a lot of reading. Your eyes, you get done, you can't even see, man. All right. All right, let's finish up here. Bam, 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 bam. I really want to get past all of this because I want y'all to hear the worst than slavery or the other enslavement. Right now, we're just dealing with freedom, blah blah blah. This is good. This is good info here. All right, let's see. I'm skimming through. I don't want to pass anything important. I roll my shirt. All right, so I'm gonna go 10 pages down. I'll stop at 31. I'm gonna go to 41. Right. Okay, I can't skip that. All right, cool, cool, cool. Oh yeah, part two is when it got animated. All right, all right. So I'm gonna end right there because I want to do chapter two a little later. So one is kind of like you see, it's very illustrative, yellow rhinestone, all that stuff. But chapter two it gets into the action. All right, so I'm gonna stop right there because I'm eager to get to the action. All right, stop with this philosophy bullshit. Big, all this fancy polite writing. Let's get to the action. All right, so I'm gonna stop right there, and